Our guest on C-SPAN's Newsmakers this week is Kentucky Senator Dr. Rand Paul. Our viewers at C-SPAN will remember he was a 2016 presidential hopeful. He's now serving a second term in the United States Senate. He has a new book out called Taking a Stand, Moving Beyond Partisan Politics to Unite America. In the Senate, he serves on the Foreign Relations, Health, Education, Labor and Pensions Committee, and Homeland Security. And he's got a bill that he's advancing in the Senate on health care. Thank you for being our guest this week.
Thanks for having me.
Let me introduce the two reporters who will be asking questions. Niels Lesniewski covers the Senate for CQ Roll Call. Dave Weigel covers politics for the Washington Post. And Niels, you are up first with questions.
And I'll dovetail off of what Susan said in the introduction to ask you about your healthcare proposal, but also what's your conversations with your Republican colleagues in the Senate and maybe even also in the House are in terms of how far away we are from seeing movement on a repeal and replace of Obamacare.
All right. Well, I'm a big advocate that they should happen simultaneously. I think it's not fair to just repeal and then say, oh, well, what's the American public going to do? How are we going to try to provide them with more insurance? We've criticized Obamacare for 6 years. We should get rid of it if that's what we think is appropriate, but we should replace it with something that helps people to find, access to health care. I think it's met with a pretty good reception so far. It, I think, is the conservative proposal out there. We don't replace Obamacare with another big government program. We replace it with market reforms that we think will expand how much insurance gets in the hands of consumers, but also allows them to buy something that would be inexpensive. The president's voiced his support for a replacement on the same day, or at least that's what he told me when we talked. And I've also spoken with members, conservative members in the House, as well as with some in leadership, including Congressman Price, who I've spoken to a couple times now on this.
I have another question about, lonely stands. What did you make of the way Elizabeth Warren conducted herself in the Senate? I'm asking one as somebody who has taken stands in the Senate, filibusters that drew attention to an issue. And I ask in part because we might see Democrats do more of that if health care they see is under threat from full repeal. But what did you make of what Warren did? And
I think there's a difference between taking a stand on something you truly believe in that is principled, that sometimes excites people in both parties. And when I took a stand against the nomination of John Brennan to be CIA head, it was mostly about the issue of whether or not the American government could drone an individual in America that's not on any kind of battlefield, and actually got support from both sides. But I didn't make it personal about John Brennan. I didn't attempt to go after his character. I didn't attempt to call him a racist or, imply something, unsavory about him as a character. And we do have rules on that. And even reading someone else's letter, it did appear as if they were trying to destroy a man's character. And there are two sides to everything. But I think the American public is more open to discussion of issues than they are to character assassination.
Let me take both pieces of what you said in response there. We noticed that you voted against confirmation of Mike Pompeo to run the CIA, but you voted for your colleague, Senator Sessions, to be the Attorney General. And we'll probably get into a few more subject areas, but just starting on the issue of surveillance powers and the things that led you to take the action that you did a couple of years ago, how concerned are you that the Sessions Justice Department, the Pompeo CIA, the potential ODNI administration of Dan Coats are going to go back more towards the direction that you've been opposed for many years?
I'm very concerned. And while I do have some agreements with President Trump on less regulation, less taxes, replacing Obamacare, on surveillance we may not be, or on privacy on the same wavelength. We'll have to see. There was a discussion in the White House the other day about civil asset forfeiture. I think civil asset forfeiture is a terrible idea until you've convicted someone. And I'd like to have that discussion with the president. I've had that discussion with Senator Sessions. And I think some of the things we've done, particularly to poor people in our country deal in cash more than wealthier people, or more than people who have their life better planned out, who might deal with money in a different way. They have cash and they walk around. It doesn't make them automatically guilty of a crime because they deal in cash. And so I think in order to take someone's money from them, the government ought to prove that it was ill-gotten. And I think the other side, they worry, oh, if someone's caught with 50 kilos of some kind of drug and then there's $50,000 in cash sitting there, that somehow the people who are caught are going to get it back. That never happens. What we're really talking about is people driving down the road, walking down the street, that there is no, they just have their possessions taken from them without any kind of conviction. There's a real danger. And there have been instances of up and down the country of little towns on the side of highways pulling over everybody and just taking their money, almost like, some sort of Robin Hood kind of scheme. And so I do worry about that. And I will continue to stand up for what I think is right, no matter whether it's a Republican or a Democrat in office.
Well, following on that, you just described something I think you disagree with what Senator Sessions said as a senator.
Right.
You've disagreed with him on drug policy, I think other aspects of criminal justice reform. Where do you agree with him, and what should libertarians, I think a lot of whom voted for you or wanted to see a more libertarian administration, what are they going to get from Attorney General Sessions from your conversations?
I think that's yet to be seen, okay. And I think there still will have to be a lot of standing up and saying there is a right to privacy that he needs to be observing. It was a vote where I ended up voting for someone who was a colleague and who I knew, and also who I felt like in some ways the Democrats made it much more certain that I would vote for him by trying to destroy his character. I think, to me, it's really very upsetting that they didn't choose to go after him on particular issues like civil asset forfeiture, where they might have been able to persuade someone like me. They chose to go after him and try to destroy a man's character. And the thing is I've seen pictures of him marching with John Lewis for voting rights. He says he is for voting rights. And I think it's just unfair. There are certain things that none of us want attached to our character. Nobody wants, no person that I know wants to be called racist or insensitive, or that you're for trying to prevent people to vote. We may disagree exactly on what the law should be, but that is attacking someone's motives and character to say that he doesn't want, for some reason, African American voters to vote. And I don't think it's true.
But to follow very quickly, just where are libertarians going to get policy gains that maybe they got from the Obama administration? Maybe because it was in a state in the Obama administration under Eric Holder and Loretta Lynch didn't stop it. But
it's going to be more difficult for criminal justice reform under this president and under this administration. But I will say I was disappointed under President Obama's administration that while I agreed with him on a lot of criminal justice reform, we didn't get it done. And there have been these descriptions of President Obama being aloof. I think they're kind of true. This is a sausage making factory up on the hill. You got to come up and mix it up. So in some ways, I think President Trump may be more successful because Mike Pence is up here all the time. He's sort of a creature of Congress, a creature of state government, but he knows the players, and he's also not afraid to come up here and talk to people. And I think that's, you have to have a relationship with people to get things through. And so with criminal justice reform, we could have done a lot more. It took him a long time to get engaged on it, and then he kind of didn't quite push the ball forward.
So let's talk about one of the items that's on that to-do list that I assume at some point Vice President Pence is going to be needing to get votes for, and maybe not all Republican votes, frankly, is this infrastructure package that from time to time President Trump talks about that could be, frankly, a lot of money and maybe more money than some conservatives might want. But I know that you've had some even conversations with Barbara Boxer, if I remember, on infrastructure issues. Do you see some kind of an opening for yourself to play a role in that development?
Well, I'm excited about ideas of ways we could provide for infrastructure and do it really without adding to debt or without raising taxes. So 3 or 4 years ago, I got excited about this idea of there's $2 trillion of profit, American profit overseas, of trying to encourage it to come home, but don't put it in the general fund, put it directly into the highway fund. So I called up President Obama and I said, I've got this great idea. And he was like in India on Air Force One, but he took my phone call. And so we were talking on the phone, and it's like, and I know you voted for it. See, he had voted for it. In 2005, we did a holiday. We took the corporate income tax from 35% down to 5% for a year. $300 billion came home, and about $35 billion in new tax revenue came home. And I said, I know you voted for it. Why don't you help me? Because he was talking about building infrastructure, and he was getting ready to make a trip to Cincinnati to talk about a bridge. And I flew down to Cincinnati with him. I thought, we've got this great new relationship, Republican and Democrat. We're going to get this done. And then he says, well, I don't believe that anymore. And it's like, there it goes. We never got it done. But Barbara Boxer was in favor of it. I can't completely characterize why, other than to say a lot of the companies that have a lot of the money stuck overseas are in California. You know, Apple and Oracle and Google and all these really successful high-tech companies have a lot of money overseas. But my idea is to lower the rate. I would leave it down for 5 years, and I would take all the revenue that comes home from that money coming home, the taxes on that revenue, and then I'd put it in the road fund. But the other thing that hasn't been mentioned enough is this would be an enormous stimulus for the country, not just the revenue, but the actual capital that comes home. President Obama's first, or his stimulus plan was like $800 billion to $1 trillion. This would be more than that. But it wouldn't be borrowed money, it wouldn't be government money, it'd be real money coming home that's profit that would go to profitable industries that you would think would put it into profitable use in our country.
Your story is about the difficulty of finding bipartisan working relationships, and that's actually the theme of your book. I'm wondering how you feel about the possibility for working bipartisanly with the activists that are out on the street and on social media really sending their voice to Democrats on Capitol Hill to push back even more.
You know, I think that what I've found is that there are some of it's personality driven, but I tend to have found a few sort of working partners on specific issues that, and I think what's interesting about it is it isn't compromise. It isn't me splitting the difference with them. It's me just finding a Democrat who actually we have the same position on an issue. So like Ron Wyden and I have worked together on NSA issues. We think the government should have to get an individualized warrant for an individual to look at our phone data, that we shouldn't collect everybody's phone data in America. That's an invasion of privacy. And he and I just see eye to eye on it. So it's great because it's not like we have to go and split the difference. We're in different parties, but it doesn't seem to bother either one of us that we're in different parties. Chris Murphy and I have joined together trying to block new arms sales to Saudi Arabia because there's a war going on in Yemen and no one's had any debate over this and people are dying, and there has to be someone asked the question, for every terrorist you kill, do you create 10 more in Yemen? And then all the refugees that want to come from Yemen too, then we have the old refugee debate as well. Half the world that wants to come here is because we're supplying the bombs that are, you know, dropping on their countries, and then we're going to provide for them after we bomb their country into chaos. So I have found people across the aisle. Cory Booker and I have worked on criminal justice reform. Now, it doesn't mean I agree with them on every issue. Probably 95% of the issues we don't agree on, but we kind of put those aside and work on the stuff we do agree on.
Senator, you mentioned Yemen. What have you made so far of the president's approach to executive power? Because one thing we discussed, I think, under President Obama was whether to curtail the AUMF and make the president come back to Congress for interventions like we just saw in Yemen. The other is, I think, a long discussion about the president's President Obama's use of executive orders. This president, I think, has taken a similar approach to the power of that office acting and then seeing if the court strikes it down. So what has been your reaction to both in terms of war and in terms of executive orders, this president's approach?
I think all presidents probably for over 100 years, probably from Woodrow Wilson on, have been using too many executive orders and have sort of exercised monopoly power over foreign policy. And it wasn't what our founding fathers wanted. Our founding fathers were very explicit in the Constitution, war is to be initiated by Congress. So I think much of what we do is unconstitutional, and I'll continue to oppose it no matter whether it's a Republican or a Democrat president. Now, if you tell me that someone's going to do an executive order to undo an executive order, that probably is fine. So I think a lot of what Trump will do are executive orders to undo executive orders. The recent one with regard to immigration, I think immigration law really, if we're going to do a big change in immigration law, probably should be through Congress. The problem is every time Congress writes a law on any subject, they always put a national security waiver in there. They're always trying to be careful. But a national security waiver should be for an emergency when Congress is like in a bomb shelter somewhere and can't actually meet. If Congress can meet, we shouldn't be using these waivers. So I'm kind of a fan of when we write these waivers in, making them much more difficult to use these waivers, because it is messy what's going to go on with immigration. But I also have been somewhat supportive of the idea that it's almost impossible if someone wants to come from Aleppo, Syria, over here, to know whether they're a risk or not, because who do you ask? Is there any paperwork left in Aleppo? What if they have one name and they're coming from Afghanistan? I think we do need to take some care. So I think there is somewhat of a valid interest in that. The one thing I did in legislation, though, is I offered an off-ramp also for once we know who you are to make it actually easier for you to travel. So if you're coming from Afghanistan, you've been coming for 20 years and you're a visiting professor and you come every year, we know who you are. And, as long as there's been a check, put them into global entry, which is sort of like having a frequent flyer program internationally. And I think you could do that even in some of these war-torn areas. But to tell you the truth, a new person coming from Yemen, I'm kind of thinking it's pretty hard to tell if they're a friend or foe. I mean, it's a war. I mean, Yemen's a crazy war with 4 different sides. Libya's at war. Syria's at war. I think it is hard to tell who his friend is and who his foe.
10 minutes left.
One of the things that seemed to come up during the oral arguments out in the Ninth Circuit and the appeal out of the Washington State case seems to be there's some question as to why these particular 7 countries are on the list. Is that something that concerns you, that if you're talking about countries where there are bad actors and potential terrorists being on the list, the fact that some other countries are not on the list, is that a concern?
Well, I think they say they got the list from President Obama, who had the list and maybe didn't use it exactly the same way, but there is some indication that there is more risk, and common sense would tell you that Libya and Somalia and Yemen and Syria, there's active wars going on there, that it is difficult to decide who is friend and who is foe. And so I think we do have to be cautious, but ideally that should come to Congress, and Congress should debate it, and it takes a while for Congress to figure things out, and ultimately there'd have to end up having to be some compromise. But the waivers really should be for an emergency, and we'll see what comes out of this. But I think also people get confused on this whole issue. You have people with bullhorns yelling that it's unconstitutional to ban certain people. Well, if you do not live here, you have no constitutional rights. Now, we can say that it offends our sensibilities to have rules based on certain things, but there is no constitutional provision for coming to our country. Now, if you're in our country, whether you're a citizen or a person in the country, you are treated and you are covered by the Constitution. Everybody that is here is covered. But if you're not yet here, you really aren't covered. And then it would go to legislative statute. And a lot of the statutes give wiggle room for presidents to determine certain aspects of national interest.
You just mentioned people with bullhorns. What do you see as the difference in how they're evolving and how they're pressuring politically? The Tea Party in 2009, I remember going to rallies really early in 2009 where you were there and a bigger crowd than expected was there. And what is happening right now on the left? Because this seems to be happening at almost a greater pace, in some cases greater numbers.
Well, we had big crowds in 2009, 2010, but the march after the day after the inauguration probably exceeded any of the Tea Party marches, so it was big. I think there was a lot of anger, same way sort of Occupy Wall Street had anger. And I always thought the interesting thing with Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party is they actually overlapped, and that both of them kind of thought Wall Street was, in big money, was not treating the regular person fair. But I also think, like all Occupy Wall Street, it's not real focused as far as what is exactly their want, what is exactly what they want done differently. So if you don't have an exact thing that you're actually for or against, I'm not so sure where it goes. I think time will tell. But without question, it was a big protest.
So would you have any advice, being someone who is a person who was elected to the Senate, frankly, when you were not the establishment candidate in the primary in your own party, to someone who might be a sort of outsider to Washington or to politics on the left, who might be trying to sort of do the same thing on the other side?
I'm not giving away any secrets. No, I think that it is difficult, and I'm probably the exception to the rule. And I had some things going for me. Being related to a famous father, being able to raise money did help me. Because it's extraordinary for people to win from outside of the establishment of either party, and it's actually too bad. It's one of the reasons I'm also for term limits, because I think if you had more term limits and people came and went, you'd have a better chance for people who are outside. I think it's good to have, people always talk about diversity, but the thing is I'm not so big on, I don't care what color your skin is. I don't care really, but I think we need diversity of sort of ideology and diversity of background. So we have a lot of people who all they've ever done their whole life is hold public office. I think we need more people for diversity of background that have held other jobs. And when young people ask me, and I get a lot of young people or interns and come through, they say, oh, when I finish college, I want to be a congressman or I want to be a senator. And it's like, go do something real, make something real, do something purposeful with your life and be a leader in that field and then come. And that's sort of the way I think it should happen. There are good people who came immediately and have been here their whole life, but I think you get a broader wealth of experience if you did something else first.
5 minutes left.
Well, speaking of that kind of diversity, why should someone who believes in free trade, who believes in the things we're talking about in libertarianism, why should they remain a Republican? Because in 2015 and 16, you're making an argument that to win, the Republican Party needed to expand to people with these differing views, bring in people with tattoos, long hair. The party that won was not like that. It was much more, I think, nationalistic in terms of closing off trade deals, in terms of the way the president's acted. So why should a libertarian remain this party instead of going to the libertarians?
Well, that's a hard sell for people, and I think you get candidates, and you have to go with a candidate that has a preponderance of the beliefs. Some don't choose that. They say, I'm going to go with who I think is my candidate, and they stay in the Libertarian Party or the Green Party or wherever they are. And then most of the rest of the public kind of chooses who is slightly better than the other or has a weighted interest that they like better. But I still continue to believe, it didn't work out so well, but I continue to believe that broadening the Republican Party to include people of all different races, all different sort of backgrounds, and everything that is a more diverse and kind of party is going to be the answer. That I think sort of the idea of nationalism and the idea of let's encase ourselves in a wall is not necessarily a winning strategy for a long period of time, because we are an increasingly diverse country. And I think Republicans do have to compete for Hispanic votes, African American votes, youth vote. We do have to compete in those areas. Women's vote. There were a lot of women here on that march. We do have to compete in all of that if we're going to win chronically. But I frankly was surprised that Trump was able to build a coalition that I didn't think was possible to win the Electoral College that way. But I think I wasn't the only person that was surprised.
Our time's running out, and I want to get to the Gorsuch nomination. Where do you think how do you see it playing out after his comments this week, Judge Gorsuch, with his disappointment at the president's criticisms of the judiciary?
I think he's an incredibly talented, capable guy who passed unanimously. And I think one of the hurdles for those who are very partisan about this thing is that they voted unanimously for him. The Democrats voted unanimously for him just a few years ago. And the interesting thing, if you look at his track record, and let's say social issues are really important to you, and you're on one side or the other of whatever the social issue is, and you think, well, gosh, I don't want this guy because he's a conservative. He's also a guy that says, a lot of these issues should be left to legislators and that judges shouldn't be legislators. So I could actually see where people on the left could look and say, well, maybe someone who administers the law isn't going to be saying we have to have one social policy for the whole country, or that there is one size fits all for every decision. And I think if we all believe that way, we'd be a little bit less angry with each other if we didn't think government always had the answer to every one of our social disagreements. And I think he might find that him in saying that he doesn't want justices to be legislators and that some of these things don't have a one-size federal answer, and that executive power has its limits. I think there could be things that that everybody could like in a Justice Gorsuch. We'll see.
Should the president be criticizing the judiciary?
The thing is, some people saying, oh, that's, the Constitution, the separation of powers. Well, the Constitution doesn't say you can't criticize. Now, there may be a history of saying presidents shouldn't do it, and there may be, forms as to manner and things like that. But there isn't any sort of legal or constitutional reason why he can't. Many criticize President Obama. When President Obama sort of lectured the judiciary before the decision on Obamacare. And I think many will criticize President Trump for saying that. I've taken it as my policy not to make any comments on presidential tweets.
Closing question. We have about a minute left.
I'll take a closing question and sort of follow up on that point. Do you see, I know in 30 seconds I'm going to ask you whether or not, what's your view on whether or not the president or yourself might have any views on Marbury Madison, which is something that of all the topics I asked
now
during,
you open that up with 30
I asked
seconds to
way
go.
back at the beginning of the presidential campaign, and
Right.
I feel like we're having a discussion about
And
that
for the
now.
viewers, we're talking about judicial review, whether or not, I guess, the court can examine the constitutionality of things. I think courts can and should examine the constitutionality. In fact, I think the court hasn't been as active as I'd like to see. And I have this debate all the time with some conservatives who say, oh, judicial restraint needs to be that we presume that all laws are constitutional. I'm a big fan of Judge Andrew Napolitano, and he talks about instead of presuming constitutionality, we should presume liberty, the natural liberty, our God-given liberty that we're born with, and that there should have to be a justification for laws, not vice versa, that we should say, oh, every law is fine and constitutional unless we really have reason. And that actually gets to a longer discussion on the Obamacare case and Justice Roberts' ruling. But yeah, I think the presumption should be for liberty, not for constitutionality.
Dave Weigel, do you have a 20-second quick closer for the senator?
Have you talked to President Trump about ending the Fed?
No, but I need to. Now, he said he was for it on the campaign trail, and we actually have a little bit of a coalition going. Maybe Bernie Sanders voted for it, and so did Tammy Baldwin, and most of the Republicans. In the House, we've gotten 350 votes. So I will when I get a chance. I've got a list of things that I want to go over with him, but I'm kind of biding my time a little bit.
Well, since I call the time here, I'll finish with the issue we started at the beginning. Do you see healthcare progressing in this first session of Congress?
Something will happen. I'll be very surprised, be utterly shocked if there is not a repeal vote and that it doesn't pass. So we will pass a repeal. Question is, how much will be repealed? Will there be any replacement inside of the repeal bill? And then there be a separate replacement bill. I'm predicting there'll be both. There'll be repeal and replacement. What I don't know is whether any Democrats will be happy enough by then to vote for some sort of replacement.
Thank you for being with us this week.
Thank you.